This is another iRaw podcast.
It's surprising to me, and maybe for many scholars in the social sciences and humanities, that on a day-to-day basis, there's hardly any effort really to define public health or even what is a population. It's part of the practical reality. And a lot has gone into explaining that population health is not the same as individual health. That's a big, big, big story for very important reasons, for good reasons. What we're moving into discussing today, multi-species publics, is different automatically because we're no longer in the world of a monoculture. It's not about purely humans.
Welcome back to Season 7 of the Animal Tone podcast. This season, we're focused on animals and multi-species health. And in today's episode, we're talking about healthy publics. Two guests join me on the show today, Melanie Rock and Gwendolyn Blue, who have written with one another on numerous occasions. Their writing is excellent, it's theoretically rich, and it's really exciting to engage with. And we had an equally exciting conversation on the show today. We spoke about everything from what constitutes health, the variety of ways in which health and the concept of public have evolved and changed over time, and what potentials and pitfalls this means for some of our relationships with animals or the more than human world. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Melanie Rock is a professor at the University of Calgary in the Department of Community Health Sciences. Since joining the University of Calgary's medical school in 2003, Melanie has drawn on her training in anthropology, health promotion, and social work in a series of projects centered on multi-species research. These projects have spanned community services, family dynamics, and social policies. The funders have included the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. To date, Melanie has led or co-authored more than 100 scholarly publications. One of the scholars with whom Melanie has often published and written with is Gwendolyn Blue, who is a critical interpretive social scientist who conducts research on environmental governance, public science, and participatory practice. She tends to focus primarily on symbolic and epistemic politics, that is, how issues are represented, whose expertise counts, and which values matter. All of these questions come up over the course of our conversation today. Gwendolyn enjoys talking about how these politics influence participatory engagement across issues such as climate change, genomics, and zoonotic disease. She is particularly interested in identifying the assumption, values, and contexts that open up and close down inclusive engagement. We have a fantastic conversation, and like the previous one when we spoke about multi-species health, this idea of healthy publics, I think, really lays the groundwork and the foundation for the season that follows. How do we start to think about the different relationships humans have with a variety of species? This season is sponsored by Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, a research group in Canada, as well as the Remaking One Health Indies project, a research project that is based in Edinburgh and looking at dog-human relationships in India. Today's episode also has a third sponsor, and the Phoenix Zones initiative seeks to challenge outdated policies and practices that drive the exploitation of vulnerable individuals and communities. They look at both humans and animals in considering how these various complicated situations collide and coalesce. So thank you so much to the sponsors for supporting the show. And thank you, dear listeners, to listening to the show today. Be sure to go and check out our website, the blog, the merch store. And if you've got 2 minutes of time, please, please, please leave a review or rate the podcast wherever you listen. Okay, let's get to the show. Hi, Gwendolyn and Melanie. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm really delighted to have you both on the show. I've heard a lot about your work from other scholars, and I think the concept that we're focusing on today is really important. So as you know, this season we're focused on multi-species health, and you both have written in different ways about animals and about health, but importantly for our conversation today, this idea of healthy publics. So I'm hoping that we'll dive into that a fair bit over the course of the next hour or so. But before we get into that, you two represent scholars who have worked together for a long, long, long time. You're one of these duos that have produced a lot of stuff together and have found a way to make it work, which is really fascinating. So could you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you two started working with one another, and also how you became interested in animals? Was this what brought you together, or did you come to that separately? Give us a little bit of your story.
Well, I can go first. I'm originally from Alberta, the province of Alberta, where the city of Calgary is located. And it's conventional where we are now to give a land acknowledgement for traditional peoples. So I'm not going to do the full rendition, but I just do want to signal that I'm from settler heritage. So I was at the University of Calgary already when Gwen or Gwendolyn was being interviewed for a position in a different department. And I attended the public presentation. She can say more about this. It was in the multispecies realm, and I was really impressed and really excited about the possibility that she would become a colleague, to the extent that even though I wasn't on the committee or for the selection, that I did take the initiative to write a letter to the hiring committee to express my enthusiasm.
Wow, that's amazing. I hope to one day have an interview where someone from outside is like, damn, she's so amazing. I need to just tell everyone who's in charge. That must have felt really good. And so you did, I'm guessing you got the job and you two ended up working together.
That's right. And I want to shout out to Melanie as well, is when you're starting out especially with a job hire, it's such a nerve-wracking experience. And to have support, and particularly support from female mentors, has been absolutely fundamental for my entire career. And I think that especially when you're working in an area that at the time was not very prevalent. So people would often ask about my dissertation topic, what on earth are you going to do with that? Like, what does this even mean to study animals, to talk about animals in the realm of politics? That's much more common now. But I think when Melanie and I were both working on our respective dissertation topics, and then as we became young assistant professors, this was still not very common in the realms that we were. So I was trained initially in cultural studies, and my first thoughts as I went through all of the training in cultural studies was that there was a lot of omissions around questions of the animal. So we talked a lot about inequalities. That was very much prevalent in our training. But it seemed that the animal question, as it were, as Jacques Derrida said, was always pushed off to the side, or animals were considered the backdrop. Animals were considered something that really didn't matter in the study of culture. And I found that to be profoundly both disturbing but also generative, and was really excited to have found the work of people like Donna Haraway to open up that space to think about culture differently.
Mm-hmm. What got you interested in animals in the first place? Were you looking at animals in your undergrad? Where did animals start to kind of, you said there, animals seem to be neglected. And of course, when you're looking at things like inequality at a particular moment, I think a lot of people were maybe speaking about how race and gender were often compared about this idea of the human. And I think, it's kind of interesting when you realize how much humanity has been used as a kind of marker, but rarely were animals or animality brought up with animals, if that makes sense. I think kind of comparing people of color or women to animals was regular, but animals didn't really make it into the analysis. And I didn't think that way myself until I think my PhD or later into my master's. How was the journey for you when you started to realize that animals were actually subjects or beings that were worthy of consideration in these debates?
Maybe I'll take that first and then hand it over to Melanie. I'll say also I'm from Alberta, and I am the third generation of growing up in a rural community in Alberta. And I also spent a lot of time working in parks. And I had when I was doing my master's, I didn't know what to do my topic on. So I actually had an encounter with a grizzly bear. And that changed all of my ideas about grizzly bears, because the bear didn't do what I expected it to do. And I didn't do what I expected it to do. And so I can maybe give some examples of this later on, but it really got me thinking about what do we mean when we think about these animals that we share these spaces with, and then in many ways know very little about. So I wrote my master's thesis on discourses of wilderness, looking at how grizzly bears are represented in popular culture. And then I took that into my PhD dissertation. And again, it was about a surprise And it was a bit of a funny surprise, but it was a bumper sticker that I started to see when I would come home to Alberta. And it was a sticker that said, I heart Alberta, the shape of the province, beef. Now, bumper stickers are very common in the United States where I was studying, but less so in Canada. And I just saw so many of these bumper stickers. And it made me think, well, what is going on here that people are putting this bumper sticker, I heart Alberta beef, on their cars at a time when we have an invariably fatal disease, mad cow disease, that is in the public news that's causing a lot of problems with our global food supply. And so it was that surprise that led me to think about what are the relationships with cows, and particularly beef cattle. I know Claudia used to study dairy cattle, but I was really interested in this very personal but also political relationship with beef cattle, and in the face of an infectious disease like mad cow disease.
Fascinating. What a place to be in when asking these questions. Isn't one of the biggest, I don't know if this is a true, you read these kind of random facts and you're not too sure if they're true, but isn't one of the biggest transport routes of cows in the world between Alberta and the United States? Isn't there a highway there that's just the transportation of cows being taken? I'm going to have to check this up. I don't expect you to know the answer to this. I need to fact check this, but what a place to be asking these questions. And I have to ask, what was the encounter with the grizzly bear? Otherwise, I'm going to forget. What was the encounter? What happened?
Oh, okay. So I was working. I was living and working in a park called Kananaskis, and I would ride my bike every day to work. And I was on my way to work on this tiny little trail that I would then access the highway. And up comes this bear. It was probably a juvenile bear, maybe 1 or 2 years old, and it was a grizzly bear. And we had this moment where we locked eyes. And the funny thing is, at the time, I was working to educate people about what to do about bears. So if you see a bear, don't run away, be very calm, back up slowly. But what I did after having this moment of locking eyes with this small bear was do exactly the opposite of what I told people to do. I turned around on my bike and I booted out of there as fast as I possibly could. And then I did something equally stupid, which was to turn around again and look to see what the bear was doing. And the bear had just sat there with his head kind of cocked, looking at me like in this very curious manner. And I didn't know. And I was trying to figure out, I didn't feel scared. The bear was just really kind of curious, maybe a little bit playful, maybe just a little bit annoyed that something had gotten in his way, just like I was, but certainly not threatening. The funny thing is, the day after, I rode down that same trail and I ran into a moose. But a young moose, I wasn't as scared. I rang my bell and tried to get out of the way. That's when I felt fear. The moose just had this look in his eye that I got out of its way as fast as I possibly could.
I mean, they were huge. I don't think people know, I've never seen a moose in real life, but moose are ginormous animals. I think we think of them, I mean, there are many really, really big deer out there, but their legs alone are sometimes taller than most cars, right? They're massive animals.
Absolutely, yes. And so that was my first real sense of danger in the wilderness, was with a moose, not the bear, which was interesting.
And it sounds like you had a really incredible presence of mind to just think about what this encounter meant. It's not like you're saying this encounter was what the encounter is of everyone encountering a bear, but that the fact that this wasn't the stereotypical idea of a bear will see you and maul you is challenging, and it's deserving of attention, that bears could look at us as something other than something to eat or a threat.
I was reminded, I hadn't read Jacques Derrida at the time, but later on I was reminded of Jacques Derrida's reflections when he's looking into the eyes of his cat and wondering what his cat thinks of him. And also I think that these questions of what does it mean to try to understand that encounter, those contact zones between ourselves, but also ourselves with carnivores.
What an incredible story. How about you, Melanie? How did you become interested in questions about animals and focusing on animals in your scholarship?
Well, Gwen and I have many parallel lives, perhaps. And so one of them is I also come from rural Alberta. And on both sides of my family are farming families, including livestock. And Claudia, I'm aware that you prefer cows over cattle. And I'll just say that, like, for me, growing up, that was one of the fundamental elements that had to be accepted and to be reckoned with, was with that as a family, then the livelihood was largely depending on animals, And I do want to highlight that it's not to say that an animal or two is in a commodity space doesn't mean that there isn't an effective relationship. Like the two are not mutually exclusive, and this can sometimes be a challenge for me, at least, in interacting with some facets of advocacy and scholarship in animal studies and animal advocacy. So I don't want to derail our conversations today, but I think it's just important to highlight that there can be some plurality and mutual understanding, but also sometimes mutual misunderstanding. So I lived on a farm where the animals that were in a commodity space, at least some of the time, included cows, sheep. Those were the prime actors, and then dogs to some extent as well. And so that was part of my early growing up, was recognizing that this was actually not only an identity but also a livelihood. I grew up in the 1970s. It's a time when, in this part of the world, rural Alberta, that we went from much more of a subsistence and almost a national economy to be part of an international commodity market. Much and all is in the colonial period, and I don't want to suggest that the colonial period is finished, but under as part of the British Empire, then part of what Canada could do as a country was try to keep out certain diseases, and that was scrapie, as an example, would be one, which was important later for BSE, for bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Wow, I haven't said that one for the full on for a little while. So that was part of my everyday. There were horses around on cousins and aunts and uncles and so forth on both sides of my family also had animals in some cases, not all. Some lived in urban areas. Similar to what Gwen discussed, in my own case, my PhD is in anthropology, and I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology as well. And so there was a lot of mention of animals, but there wasn't very much discussion of animals. Levi-Strauss famously said that animals are good to think with. And, Donna Haraway is amongst those who have said that animals are good to live with, but then also to highlight we don't seem to live equally well with all animals. And in fact, as human beings, we don't live equally well either. So just to put the final pin on that is to say that when we are object, and for very good reasons, to the commodification of animals, the trade in animals, the subjugation of animals, then it's also important, from my point of view, in terms of my own experience, but also training, is to highlight that as human beings, as our own bodies, that we are also commodified too. And that was one of the key insights from Marx and Engels, is to highlight that our labor, our time, the time in our body is divided up into chunks in a way, and that our bodies are supposed to be rented. You go and you work in a factory, you're rented. You're not full on a farmer all the time, or a cottage industry. Your body's rented, but it's no less commodified for that. And I think we're edging into the discussion of publics in the sense of what excites us, what bothers us, what solidifies us, what destroys us, is to say that within our intellectual and academic field, but also our social justice as being critical here, that this can be a site of a lot of discomfort. And one advantage of the kind of training we have is to look very carefully and analytically at as you were saying earlier, Claudia, the notion of what is the human, the sort of universalizing move to the human, as though that is meaningful apart from a whole set of suppositions and practices that make that leap possible. Of course, very important, because the key element of a history of racism is to deny humanity to people, for sure. But humanity is also denied to people if they cannot speak for themselves in the usual ways, for example. So I guess that to put in a more coherent package, this was part of my everyday growing up. And but increasingly that's an unusual position in North America, to have had a rural background and grown up in that way. So as I became older and I traveled in different social circles, I was still carrying this legacy, and increasingly that became irritating to me that it wasn't front and center. And certainly in the science studies realm that Gwen and I both have traversed and learned from and contributed to, then again, animals were kind of relegated to things only, especially at that time, whereas the relationships are much more complicated. So the diabetes example and around metabolism that I studied for my PhD, dogs participated unwillingly, one could say, as experimental animals in the commercialization of insulin, but quite quickly dogs became patients who received insulin, and at that time the insulin would have come from cows and from pigs. So anyways, that those kinds of relationships I felt were important to understand, but it wasn't possible really to do that as part of my PhD. I didn't feel, not, or at least I waited, I guess you could say, for after graduation to explore some of those ideas more fully.
I mean, these are really complex ideas that you're playing with here, and people like you have laid the foundation for folks like me who've just done my PhD to build on and think through them. But I really appreciate the complexity with which you're viewing both humans and animals, and in the same move, appreciating that these concepts of human and animal are powerful. They do something all the time, while at the same time saying that they're not totalizing. And same thing is about victim and perpetrator. Like I do think that when farmers say, I love my animals, while at the same time sending them off to slaughter, even though this seems highly contradictory and something that I would possibly argue with someone about, it's not that it's not possible. I think if there's anything I believe that humans have is the capacity to be contradictory and confounding, even to ourselves, to do things differently to what we say or think we believe in. And I think I have a dog at home who I absolutely love. But if you really take a serious and critical eye to the pet industry, you start to ask some serious questions about what it means to put a leash around an animal, control his movement. And we've spoken about this, I think, a fair bit on the podcast, So I think it's very easy to point fingers, not so easy to kind of think through the complexities of how we came to be in these structures. And that goes for both the animals and the humans. But I think there is power in saying that out loud, right? To say that this is an unequal system that's really materially and socially very important for the animals involved. So you've both had a background in kind of thinking about different diseases and ailments. Was this always part? And so it must be a really exciting time now as One Health kind of enters the discourse. I think there's a lot of trouble with One Health, but you've both got a long history of thinking about animals and disease and health. Why do you think health is an important kind of locus to think about our relationships with animals?
Oh, I can take that one on first. And just to do a little bit of digging, is that in anthropology, medical anthropology, often at the beginning of a class, at an undergraduate level, we would go through some key terms such as health, disease, injury, illness, sickness. Those would be some examples. And so the one point to make was that health, in terms of the history of that word in English, comes from the notion of being hale or whole. That's the meaning of it. In French, santé has a somewhat different approach. It has historically emphasized more the notion of functioning, or what we might think of as normalcy and pathology. And so the word in English of sane or sanity comes from that root in Latin. Think what happens when you put health on one side and sane or sanity side by side. I don't want to suggest that in French, santé as a word, which French is a second language for me, but that santé means sane only, but it does highlight that even in English, different words that refer to health have different roots and somewhat different meanings. So we always need to ask the question, what, as you were saying, Claudia, what do these words mean, or what are they being made to mean as we go along? With respect to One Health, yes, that word and term has been in use now for at least 20 years in veterinary medicine. And it's I would have to say it's probably done a lot of good, but it's also has been part of doing a lot of damage. In terms of the way thinking of the connections between human and animal health in anthropology, then the more serious work that has looked at how people have related to animals, and especially what we might think of as livestock, then there were a lot of medical or healing treatments that were practiced both with human bodies and with animal bodies. That idea of a common enough physiology that you could use some of the same materials on and approaches on both is to be found pretty much anywhere where farming or livestock husbandry was practiced. And I'll just finish one more point, is to say also simultaneously what we might think of as witchcraft or magic, which also has roots with contemporary biomedicine. Also, there has been a lot of interest and concern about other animals. So, yeah.
So there are many kind of interconnections. When you open up the word health, animals invariably come up, whether it's animals being tested on, whether it's animals being treated, whether it's animals being included in the kind of mythology of what health is. Animals have a way of just emerging or being present when humans start to ask questions about human health.
Yeah, so that veterinary medicine in lots of ways has driven the contemporary usage of One Health. That's been highlighted in previous episodes on the podcast as well, and in policy circles. But the notion of human and animal health being linked together, including in Western medicine, is much older than that. So you could look at Claude Bernard in the context of in French science, or William Osler in terms of biomedicine, being he was based mainly in Montreal and McGill, and there was a lot of interest at that time in what people sometimes called one medicine or comparative medicine, comparative physiology. Enough said.
Fascinating. Gwendolyn, do you want to add something here to how we kind of think through the connection between animals and health?
So my work, unlike Melanie's, isn't directly situated within the domain of health. I've been much more an accidental tourist, if you will, into what we might call health. But what I find fascinating about the idea of health, and we might call the framing of health, and particularly something like public health, which I think is a really unique aspect of thinking about health, is what it means when we open up these questions about who's included and who's excluded, what kinds of knowledge counts as health, and what kinds of knowledge is left to the side. So those questions around framing and representation, or what we might say public engagement with issues that involve science and technology, which is a really wordy phrase, but an important one, is where I situate most of my inquiries. So I think that it's in asking how is health defined, for whose purposes, and with what effects, is a very, very important question. And again, it's much more common nowadays within the rubric of One Health or planetary health to think about humans and animals as having conjoined activities when it comes to health. So my health is important for my dog's health, for instance, but the health of, I'll just go back to the example of beef cattle. The health of beef cattle is also really important for the health of humans in various ways, whether you're consuming that beef or whether you're part of a beef producing nation. So I think that thinking of health, not only limiting it to the human, which I think can be a really easy thing to do to privilege the human when we think about health, to open that up to the question of the animal is really important. And then I also firmly believe that place and specific cases, or even more simply, stories matter. So in tracing, how is it that when we look at events that unfolded, do we think about health in different ways? And what are we doing when we define health in particular instances? So I can give some practical examples of why that matters and why I would say that health matters for humans and animals. And it was really an eye-opening moment for me to realize that it's not only my own personal health, but that is always a multi-species affair. And I credit a lot of Melanie's work for that insight. And this idea of the public also matters.
Yeah, I mean, you said several really interesting things there, because I'd like to know kind of the difference between health and public health. Again, I think a lot of folks use interchangeably. So what does that difference mean? And of course, when you spoke about examples there, I think about your paper and how you discussed the floods in Calgary. So maybe we could spend a spot of time just unpacking those two elements. What is the kind of, what is public health really when we say public health, and also how were your experiences in Calgary and the Calgary floods? How did these questions emerge during that time for you?
I could take the first part. I wouldn't claim to have more or better knowledge than Gwen does with respect even to health. I think what the kinds of questions that Gwen has shared with you and with the audience are the key ones, really. And that's to ask those questions: what is happening here or there? That's really crucial. With respect to public health, and I've been employed in public health now for more than 20 years, it's a long time. In lots of ways, my PhD was in public health, and my master's, which is in social work. In lots of ways, social work and public health are work side by side, certainly in terms of community services and social policy. The key thing to say is that public health almost always means people, human health, populations. And usually there's not a lot of thought that has to go into what constitutes these populations. They're containers, and they exist statistically, if not in a real or material sense. So examples would be the Canadian population, the population of people who receive dialysis, the population of people who are exposed to West Nile virus, and so on and so on. So there are implicitly or explicitly various kinds of boundaries or containers that are usually territorial in nature, either because they have jurisdiction, national jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction, and so on, and or because they are centered around an institution. Like the Mayo Clinic has a population of patients wherever those patients have come from. The cardiac unit at the Foothills Hospital has a population. That population happens to extend into northern Canada because people would come to a facility like the Foothills Hospital if they live in Yellowknife, if the situation is serious. So it's surprising to me, and maybe for many scholars in the social sciences and humanities, that on a day-to-day basis, there's hardly any effort really to define public health or even what is a population. It's part of the practical reality. And a lot has gone into explaining that population health is not the same as individual health. That's a big, big, big story for very important reasons, for good reasons. What we're moving into discussing today, multi-species publics, is different automatically because we're no longer in the world of a monoculture. It's not about purely humans at all.
But does that mean with the idea, so if public health is attached to specific conceptions of a population, whether it's the Mayo Clinic population or let's say population who's had heart disease, so you kind of use these randomish imagined connections to draw populations together, and once you've got a population, you've kind of got a public health thing, container of sorts.
Yes, you do, and you have this sort of like duty of care.
But this is exclusively a human species kind of population, no matter how you're cutting up these different populations, whether it's heart disease, whether it's Mayo Clinic patients, implied here is always human. So
in terms of public health as an institution, like capital P, capital H, if you will, like the acid test, pH, the acid test is about, is there humanity there? No humanity there, no public health. I mean, historically, I don't want to say that that's the way everybody thinks about it today, for example. But if you were to look at all of the different programs in public health, say Masters of Public Health, epidemiology, and et cetera, in terms of the way those disciplines and fields are instructed, the way they're taught, the way they're practiced, then it's about people.
And what you're suggesting is animals need to be part of this conversation.
Well, they are, exactly. And so there's a move already that might seem really subtle between population health and public health. And that's already been I think it's fair to say, a struggle, like within the context of human health sciences. That's a struggle to not focus only on individuals or families or so on, to look at bigger blocks, but to then say, oh, and it's the public is not purely human, because there are technologies, the way you described it, somewhat random or arbitrary. They're held together by a data bank or a hospital or a border, all kinds of, like, I guess they're not random in the sense that they have reasons for being there. It's not like a lottery, but there's not any reason that they should be there for the purposes that you then have, treating heart disease, for instance, or preventing staph infections, preventing serious infections in hospital settings. But those technologies, and Gwen can speak more to that too, those technologies are gluing the whole thing together, like chewing gum and binder twine, on the farm, so to speak. It's not, you don't necessarily see it, but it's there. And sometimes it's rigidly held together and sometimes not so much. When we start to take seriously that we're not only concerned about human health, but also about the health of other animals and the environments that we share, then it's no wonder that is quite challenging and even upsetting in some quarters, or why it can be frustrating to see after 20 odd years that One Health kind of can become really a pretext or excuse for killing off a whole bunch of animals, or starving people. I mean, all kinds of things are happening that under the auspices or umbrella of One Health that are upsetting, certainly for me, and I'm sure for both of you and for the listeners. But it is a big move. Like, it's not a minor matter to say that public health is more caring about more than human lives. That's a big move already.
And is it a big move because it forces us to look at these kind of technologies and structures that you were talking about in a more dynamic way? So when you start to add multiple species, you start to say, well, these technologies are not obviously equitable in a pretty fundamental way. Is that what makes it so drastic? Is that it compels us to look at technologies and structures that we've just taken for granted?
Well, I feel at this point I don't have any further need to pontificate, as though I have more answers or better answers than Gwen does. So let me pass the baton. But I think the way you've asked it, Claudia, those are key questions. They are key questions, and maybe none of us really have the number one or the all-encompassing answers, and that's challenging too.
I'm going to build on the insights that Melanie has given us. And again, my training is really to look at issues of representation. And what I find very generative about the idea of public health, and I want to say that it's not one idea, it's very multiple, it's constantly evolving. And the term itself is, as society changes, the term it opens up as well. So we might think about public health is rooted in the nation, for instance, but I think increasingly people talk about something like global public health, this understanding that we can't just root our understanding of health in the individual, but nor can we just only take it from the population into this idea of the nation. But we have to think about these interconnections among nations, because we have the flow of transportation, we have the flow of communication, and we have the flow of pathogens, toxins, all of those things that are imbricated within this thing that we might call our health. So it's a generative term. It's a term that's constantly evolving. But I want to focus on this idea of public, because I think that is really important. So it's health, as Melanie has discussed, a need to consider that health is more than human. But I think that there's something in the public as well that's very important to consider. And so this transformation from biomedical health, focused very much on the individual, to public health it moves us into populations, but it also encompasses a different kind of values and a different kind of an ethic. And there's two of those that I want to focus on. So when we're thinking about the public as a population, we have to balance the autonomy, again, a very, very important value in a biomedical system, right? That you have to have your own personal autonomy. We can't have researchers, we can't have doctors just doing things to us based on their own will. We have to actually consent to the kinds of treatments that we have. But what does that mean on a population level? when you can't necessarily get the consent of a population in the same way that you would as an individual. And so examples would include things like the release of genetically modified mosquitoes, for instance, to address things like malaria or dengue fever. Those are open field trials, they're open area trials, and it's a different kind of consent that needs to take place. And so to get that consent requires more than just a conversation between a physician and a patient. It actually requires the community. And so in many ways, we have this idea of not only of population, but also of community coming into our understanding of health, because we have these values that are deeply embedded in our understanding of what it means to have a healthy population or a healthy person involves things like consent. And we know that from the Nuremberg trials. We can't just inflict expert ideas of health onto people. And so community opens up then this idea of engagement. So there is an underpinning notion of a population, of community, and I want to say an important, but perhaps not always fully realized idea of engagement, that there has to be this level of engagement with a population or with a collective of people. And then I think the work that we're trying to push a little bit more is to say it's not just engaging with human populations, but also engaging with more than human populations, with animals, which opens up big questions of consent that are not easily resolved and require us to think differently about what we mean. This is where I think that efforts to push beyond this idea of public health, to really open up this generative potential for how might we live differently in a way that really is much more conducive to well-being, to flourishing. We can do so within the banner of public health, but maybe we can be experimental and play with it a little bit more. Here, the work of Steve Hinchliffe, who has also been part of the conversations in previous podcasts, to reframe public health as healthy publics. So we can think about, maybe we need to push beyond this idea of population to think about these dynamic collectives of people, of ideas, of environments, of animals and other critters. I would add technologies as well. Although that's complicated, I don't think that it's intractable. I think that we can do that, but we need to open up our framings so that we don't get trapped within these very human-centered. But I would also argue health has been somewhat colonized by business as usual practices. Biomedical approaches tend to override our understanding of public health, technological approaches versus non-technological approaches, and increasingly behavioral approaches as well.
That's really, really fascinating. And again, it seems like you're bringing it back to geography and space, to actually think about the relationships that take place in a specific space and how, and I mean, I guess the community and the public kind of, they have slightly different connotations about who gets to make the decision, right? Who gets to, as you said, kind of consent. Sometimes I think we think about, at least in my novice understanding, I think of public health as somehow being folks in a boardroom deciding what's good for me, whereas community health being us in the community hall deciding what's good for us, which is possibly a kind of a difference in thinking about who gets to make the decisions.
To that point, just to underline your impression that I'm in the Department of Community Health Sciences, and the counterpart department at the University of Alberta, 3 hours away, is the Department of Public Health Sciences. And we might think, well, that's because we're sort of more community-minded in Calgary than in Edmonton. But honestly, a lot of it had to do with the fact that what we now think of as a medical officer of health, so people who would be physicians, but who also have 5 years often of post MD training and apprenticeship. That it used to be called, community medicine. Now it's called public health and preventive medicine. And I feel as though one of the points that you're both making, and that one of the challenges, is that can we be simultaneously thinking about large groups period, usually of people in this context, and also be community minded? Can we? What would that look like? How would we organize ourselves not to lose out on a sense of community at the expense of some notion of a higher purpose or greater good? So I think that's what I heard you say. That I think it's important to highlight. We don't want to lose going to a notion of a public. We certainly don't want to lose out on a notion of or a feeling of community. But I'll leave it there. Just want to elaborate.
I mean, I think that's really so. I mean, I speak for myself here when I say I think policy is important, and I think most people would we talk about technologies. Policy is a really important technology that enables and disables particular behaviors, right? It allows for and disallows particular behaviors, and I think we have to recognize the power of policy, but we also have to think about whose voices, or, like you said, consented or consulted in the making of that policy. And sometimes it is a matter of voices or people were consulted but don't feel listened to necessarily or consulted. And I think that's also really important. And this again kind of brings up this idea of voice. And Gwendolyn, you were speaking about representation. And obviously voice is a very important concept in thinking about democratic systems and thinking about how we make decisions. But it's been used very much as a way to exclude animals from the conversation as well. Animals can't talk about what they want. And I think there's an argument to be made here. And in your guys' paper, you spoke quite clearly about how this focus on discourse and language can be really exclusive. It's used constantly as a way to talk about animals and not with animals. So how do you think switching from public health to healthy publics does this? How does it enable, I suppose, space to think through / hear what animals need in order to flourish or in order to be healthy?
So to answer that question, I want to pull up this idea of publics, because I think that this is where, and it's interesting, even that switch from public health, notice that's a singular public, to healthy publics, we start to think more about diversity, much more about inclusion, just in the addition of a small s and a switching of the word order. Language is really powerful and can give us, again, these imaginative openings. So we could use the concept of the public, whether it's public health or healthy publics, as I want to say an entry point, maybe a space in which there's an opening to walk through the door of entities that have been excluded from a very technocratic, elitist discourse or practice. Like you said, who makes decisions about public health? It's people who have been anointed to speak about public health. And I want to say that the public in public health means that is inherently a democratic initiative, and then therefore should include a multiplicity of voices, both represented but also recognized as having legitimacy in that democratic space. Now that might get people's backs up. That statement itself might make people very uncomfortable, but I think it's important that as we think about health, that democracy plays a significant role. That's again a core value of public health. Social justice, and if we think about justice as also including democratic engagement, is part and parcel of public health and its core values. And again, I just don't think that potential has been realized. So if I can, maybe we can look a little bit at this very powerful term, the publics, unpack that a little bit. So Melanie and our work has been, I think, making an intervention that's banal, but surprisingly contentious. So all we did, I think this is a pretty simple thing, is ask who is involved in the public and what does even the term mean? And can the idea of animal public be a reasonable concept? Now, the term public comes from the Latin publicus, of pertaining to the people, and the Old French public, open to general observation by the people. And it's from that historical lineage that we get this idea that public applies to both a collective of people, but also something very visible. So there's that double meaning that I think would inform most people's understanding of the public. And the term is very central to democracy. That's why we want to open it up. So the public matters, spaces of democratic engagement, the public sphere, also the ways that decisions are rendered. We render decisions, our elected officials or our bureaucratic scientific people who are unelected but still play an important role in governance, make decisions in the public interest. We have public opinion, we have public engagement, all those things I think most people would agree are very important. So our intervention, again, in the banality of it, was simply at the first part to argue that all publics are inherently animal publics. This is banal because humans are animals, and therefore, if humans are animals, then all publics, although defined as humans, are animal publics. But it's contentious because humans, at least in a Euro-Western political tradition, from which our understanding of publics comes from, humans are considered exceptional in the realm of politics. We are political animals as humans, ostensibly, marked as different from the rest of the animal kingdom by our supposedly unique abilities for reason and symbolic communication. And we know, and again, a lot of the work that you've done on this podcast has complicated that, right? We know that there isn't this state of exceptionalism that humans have, although we do have unique capabilities within the realm of symbolic communication, which we're not exceptional vis-a-vis other animals. There's difference involved. So can we open up theoretically this idea of the public, or is it something that perhaps we should just throw away? I mean, one argument could be, let's just get rid of the idea of the public. It's so tethered to this notion of human exceptionalism that let's just get rid of it and stop using it. But I think that there's actually room for us, even if we draw back to some of the Euro-Western traditions, to be able to prise this open so that we can allow animals to come in the door of politics. So if we go back to the ancient Greek idea of the agora as the meeting place for mostly property-owning male citizens to make democratic decisions in the city-state, that is where our ideas of the public were first laid down. And we can think about this in terms of, I would say, the thinking and talking heads version of the public, where it's this collective of humans coming together to interpret information. And this is either face-to-face or increasingly mediated in the modern notion of the public. So this is different from a mass or a crowd, because the public then, again, has this idea that there's certain capacities going on. People are arguing, they're persuading, they're negotiating, they're reaching some kind of consensus, they're making decisions. It was the modern public that emerged in the 17th or 18th century in Europe through the salons, coffee houses, and table societies that we get this other idea of the public. This was an idea popularized by the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And he argued that we get this new kind of public emerging then because political ideas were discussed among these emerging social classes that were markedly different from the ruling aristocratic class. And there was a visibility to these publics. They were coming together in public houses. This is the important aspect of this, that people were coming together and they're discussing political ideas. But there's also another notion of publicness in the 17th and 18th century, that people would come together, they would share ideas through pamphlets, that there was a printing press that had already been established so that people could share ideas that could transcend the local engagements in these particular places. So we had ideas that were being spread, and later through newsprint, through radio, television, and even more recently social media, that it's representations, not only the ability to talk face to face, but also representations that make the public visible. So the act of representation constructs that public. So we've got publics as talking heads. We've got publics as being mediated through representation. And then in the 19th and 20th century, we get another different inflection of the public, this one relevant to our ideas of public health, I think, where we see the professionalization of science. And this is important for the public because science, to be able to have a realm of legitimacy, required the presence of a public to witness, legitimate, and support, and importantly, finance its accounts of nature. So science then, as a professional institution, required the public, but also used it as a marker of its own distinction. So here's where we start to see, at this time, 19th and 20th century, separations between science and the public in the singular. We see techniques of enumeration using science to be able to construct publics, like public opinion polls, that use statistical techniques to measure and categorize the public. So the public then becomes more like a population as a result of its separation from science, but also the tools of science used to enumerate and categorize the public. So by the mid-20th century, it becomes common then for science to be viewed as a profession that spoke to and not as a public. And it's really interesting that I often study how scientists think about things in different realms. And typically what I hear scientists say is, the public. They want to talk to the public as if it's this thing that's homogenous outside of themselves. But rarely do a many scientist, not all, but many scientists don't see themselves even as part of a public. So the philosopher Bruno Latour then saw this separation as contributing to this modern sensibility that somehow science speaks on behalf of nature to the public, right? It generates facts about nature that it gives to the public, whereas publics speak on behalf of politics and values and generate matters of concern. That's what we want to complicate.
That was really fascinating because you kind of gave, I think, a little bit of a genealogy of public there, which is kind of cool to, I mean, it also shows the mobility of these concepts and these words. And I think even when we were talking about health earlier, you can see the idea itself changes, but so too how the word is used changes. And Gwen, as you've mentioned here, how it's represented kind of both in public discourse, but also in let's say specialized or specific uses of the concepts. And sometimes those are different, right? Like you can have even within different disciplines using the same concepts, but it's used differently. So seeing those subtle changes in how public/publics has been understood over time was really useful. But something that really stood out for me was you said, representations that make the public visible. And at the beginning of this explanation, you spoke about how increasingly, decision-making and the public is mediated. And you mentioned this in your article as well during the Calgary floods, how media became a way to make the public visible and to challenge the idea of the public/publics being human only, because people were outraged that animals weren't kind of geared towards or thought about with the housing situation. There was big floods in Calgary in 2013. There wasn't enough housing post those floods, and people who had pets such as cats and dogs couldn't find suitable places to live. Sorry, I'm just giving a synopsis. And in essence, people went to the media as a mechanism to make the public visible, and evidently for them, the public included animals. Is that a fair kind of, because I think that's really tantalizing, because that to me implies that many of us already recognize the public as being multi-species. We already argue for and advocate on behalf of multi-species health requirements and publics, but we maybe don't include it in that way in our kind of scientific thinking and our policy decision making, but that in our communities we kind of already know that.
Yes, if I could pick up the threads here, so that our everyday experience in families and communities is multi-species. Yes, and that most of the time when it comes to what we might think of as public policy, that is more rarefied air, and we have the impression that that's when, as you were saying earlier, that people sit around a boardroom, and they make decisions about us and for us, with often things like public opinion polls or other considerations to guide the decision making. So that I feel is like it's worth highlighting. There's this sort of everyday, embodied, face to face, not all the faces are human, and a community where we live and our everyday experience outside of our immediate households is also multi-species. But somehow, and for some of the reasons certainly, and all of the reasons that Gwen has highlighted and more, when it comes to public policy, that for the most part that is seen to be about people and about people only in the first instance. So there's an octave shift. And to come back to those floods, because it was in terms of the ethical tradition of casuistry, which has its proponents and its opponents, but it is a very useful perspective, I think, for many of us in the social sciences and humanities, because it's case-based. So it invites us to look carefully and deeply into particular events and compare them over time and with one another. So one of the contrasts that was unsettling about what the political response to the flooding that occurred in this part of the world, Calgary, Alberta, southern Alberta, as we call it today for the most part, was that there was this realization that there are so many human-animal bonds, multi-species families, and by extension communities that could not be supported or sustained because people's housing had been had been flooded, contaminated, and so on. Now, the other foot falling in the forest is that is a daily reality for lots and lots of people and animals, that they cannot get housing in this part of the world. We live in a place where the rental market is very exclusionary with respect to human animal bonds. And animal welfare, animal rights, or animal advocacy organizations have responded variously over time to that reality, including in some cases, in some situations, in some places, as you're saying, Claudia, like that place-based element, by discouraging or even prohibiting people who are tenants who rent their homes from bringing animals into their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Canada, and we weren't allowed to. We weren't. It was built into our rental agreements in Kingston, and then it was it was an interesting thing because we wanted to get a dog from a shelter, but at the same time we were told by our landlord we're not allowed to. But then folks were telling us, but that's illegal. Your landlord's not allowed to tell you what to do, and it was quite a complicated thing to navigate. Yeah, and again, yeah, I think this brings into that tension of kind of policy and the reality of what people's lives are actually doing. And of course, I was in a very privileged position. I think there's a lot of work coming forward now about homeless folks who rely on their bonds with other animals to sustain themselves, and they can't get not only housing but access to emergency housing or care. So it doesn't seem to be as catered for in policy as what is needed in practice.
Yeah, so we could say it's not fair, or it's not equitable, even across humans, if we assume that people are equally attached to companion animals, that it's not fair, it's not equal for all humans, never mind for those who are on the other side of the species line. So it was an article treatment, and in the article to which you refer. And as usual, when Gwen and I have been working together, we often feel like we have sideline projects that become like forests. That's happened a few times. So squishing in like a complicated situation into one article, but that's part of it, is that there was a mobilization, and there were various kinds of solutions that were being imagined. People did come together with their animals on behalf of their animals to highlight Gwen's point around representation. How does this happen, and who takes responsibility for whom? And sometimes it was people acting on animals for whom they had an affinity, but there wasn't any formal bond or legal responsibility, say. But unfortunately, also that went away.
I mean, we saw similar things happening with COVID. The responsiveness, for me, COVID really highlighted how political will can make action happen. The speed with which, we saw airlines grounded, we saw borders closed in a way we haven't seen in a long time, and that drastic actions. I mean, whether you agree with the actions that were taken or not is not my point here, that governments can make really drastic decisions really quickly when there's a political will that was even counter to an economic desire, which really makes COVID, I think, a fascinating case study.
Well, all I wanted to say, because I think it's relevant to what our discussion has been around multispecies health and multispecies publics, is to underscore that in Canada and in some other places, including Hong Kong, there was a COVID pandemic in 2003. It was SARS, and to my mind, as someone working within the public health sphere, as a social scientist aligned with, to varying extents, public health, I'm very disappointed in the lack of preparation for some of the decisions that were made and consultation, the way that we've discussed, but also to highlight and underscore what you've said, Claudia, that because coronaviruses are infectious, there's legal permission to do a lot, and do a lot really quickly, that in a way that, for example, there isn't for some other major killers that are not so-called communicable diseases. So I hope I'm underlining what you're saying as being grounded in fact and in policy decisions rather than departing from it. Enough said.
I wanted to add to this that the the things that we've been experiencing, the floods in Calgary, I would say the effects that we're seeing of climate change. Alberta has also been really hit by forest fires, as other parts of the world have. And we have the localized effects of forest fires in Western Canada, but we also see those effects coming into places like Eastern United States, where the smoke makes it almost so difficult to live that the atmospheric air quality goes down so much, so that we see that we're interconnected with not only what we might think narrowly as health, but we can also see that health is connected to environmental changes, and particularly climate change. And that those are never only human instances or human affairs, if you will, that animals have been part and parcel of that conversation, but fall by the wayside, I think, in our expert-based communities. And so I think that our intervention with Publics is really to talk, who is our audience. We want to talk to the people who are at the decision-making table, to get them to reflect on the concepts that they use and the exclusionary ways in which these concepts can unfold. We see with SARS, both the first SARS that Melanie discussed that came out in 2003, and COVID-19 was the second SARS, right? It was a SARS virus. We see this with mad cow disease. We see this with so-called bird flu.
Yeah, the H5N1 virus, right? It's been going on for years and years. Like, everyone's like, oh, but it's hitting humans now. It's been killing millions of birds, hundreds of thousands of birds for years, right?
And if we're always thinking in this exceptionalist sense that we are somehow above or separate from animals, but I would say analogously, this sense that we've come with professional experts, to think that professional expertise removes people from the public, I think is very, very dangerous. And if we just take a step back and look at what's happening in the news media, for instance, in the unfolding of public conversations, to have a more generative view of the public, I think that we can get a better sense of what's going on. As you really clearly noted, we, in many ways, in a common sense understanding, know that animals and humans share health, and that the health of other species informs our own health. And yet that slips by the wayside when we get into our expert-based communities. So it is a bit of a poke at how experts frame issues, and perhaps asking for more self-reflection on the part of scientific experts, but also policymakers, about the terms that they're bantying around and what that means for issues of justice.
It's such an important point. And I think also to resist the tokenism of these concepts as well, because they can kind of get grappled with, and I mean, you've seen this, I think, with concepts using feminism and critical race studies. They enter the policy space, but then they get watered down to such an extent that actually the people who are advocating for these concepts, it ends up being used counter to the goals that people were originally hoping for. And I think to bring One Health, this is why One Health is having so many debates, is because One Health is actually a really radical idea. It's radical and it's transformative. But it can, just like sustainability, it can get usurped into the kind of hegemonic narrative where it ends up serving to hurt the very beings, populations, communities that it was designed to stand up for in the first place. And I think I hear you that, yeah, I don't know. For me, the more I learn, the more I feel like I know absolutely nothing at all. And I think to have a bit more humility happening in policymaking spaces and in expert spaces, and I think the pushes for interdisciplinarity are part of that. But I know we've already been speaking for over an hour now, and we haven't even gotten to the quote yet. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a bit of a stab at just summarizing some of the points that you've raised here with regards to healthy publics, and let's see how I do. So healthy publics is kind of, as you mentioned earlier, an opening of an imaginative space to kind of reimagine what we mean when we say public health. And it's a questioning of what we mean both by the concepts of public and of health. And it's a stretching of them. It's a stretching of them in terms of species, going beyond multi-species. It's a stretching of them in terms of space and also in terms of power, whose voices, bodies matter when we think about health. So yeah, multi-species or healthy publics is a kind of challenge, but it's also I guess, a recognition of the fact that how public health is operationalized is not necessarily reflective of how many people would understand their own views of their environments and their publics. I think I'm missing a bit of stuff we touched on in the beginning. There was also representation and how significant representation and mediated responses. I know that we can't get to a simple definition here, but I just wanted to make sure that I flag the most important points that have come up. Melanie?
What I wanted to say was good job, and also not to feel as though you have to use all the same words, but to like that every time we use that prefix in English, represent, recognize, recognize, or rethink, then we're on the right track, so to speak, if we're on the correct path, because it's about unpacking our assumptions and trying to stay close to the ground while also realizing that increasingly we do live in a globalized system. So as you know very well, and have written about yourself. So I personally don't feel like you missed out anything. It's more to say that the kinds of questions that you're asking and the reflections are very pertinent. The only thing I just would want to underscore right now, for the sake of our community, of the three of us today, here and now, so to speak, but also an enlarged community of scholars and activists whose concerns are grounded or generated with and through other species, is this, and that is that we want to get away from a deficit model of participation or representation, so that there's a triaging or judgment call that is made about who is worthy to be considered and who isn't. This is difficult because I'll be honest, I do swat mosquitoes, and I don't necessarily feel that I have like a really profound responsibility for mosquitoes in this way. I realize mosquitoes are part of an ecosystem, but when one bites me, I want to get rid of it. But so that may seem obvious, but there are people for whom any life form, including insect life form, is sacred, and so even there we can't necessarily decide in advance whose lives or what kinds of beings are important, but those are the key questions. And the deficit model of participation doesn't only apply to other species, it also applies to other people, and including people with disabilities, people whose way of speaking reflects growing up in places where access to, if you will, symbolic capital, being able to speak in a certain way, was denied. So in opening up the conversations and the spaces, the places, as Gwen has highlighted, an agora that is not a town square where everybody can come, but it's a mediated reality, that hopefully that is actually the essence of re-democratizing, rethinking what that might mean. What is a demos? What is a population? What are our matters of concern? But it's that deficit question that is so important in Gwen's intellectual lineage and contributions about quote unquote public participation or engagement, what that means, that is crucial to underline, I feel, at this point, because it's a double move. It excludes other species, members of other species, but it also, by implication, includes only certain human beings, and a whole lot of other people are outside the door.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to ask this focus on mediation, the extent to which it's fracturing the debate, because even what you're saying here is, we might speak about, who has different access to different privileges, who's been hurt in different ways historically, and you create different online communities, for example, that can be quite siloed, where and I don't know if this focus on a mediated response, and this is maybe coming back to the public, I feel as though something has been lost a little bit, where we no longer have public TV. In South Africa, I grew up watching SABC, which is a South African Broadcasting Corporation. And we went to school, and on a Monday, all of us would have watched the same movie and seen the same public service announcement. And there was something unifying in having consumed the same content, that we could talk about it, actually, like engage in a community discussion in some ways. But now, with the kind of fracturing of media consumption and everyone kind of consuming what's tailored to them, sometimes I enter spaces where I've consumed very different material or news to the person who's sitting next to me. And that can make having these kinds of conversations about where our values lie exceedingly difficult and very difficult to kind of get even to the same table to talk about animals, let alone talk about whether we should include animals in our public healthcare systems. Gwen, do you have something you focus on representation. What are your views there?
I have a lot to say that I'll try to keep very succinct. I'm really glad that you brought this up because Melanie and I, our first intervention was with animal publics, and later bringing this into, you had mentioned an idea of multi-species publics. I think that there might be a danger with the notion of animal publics to think of like big like us, right? Like we care about certain animals and not others. So maybe we care about the cows and the bears, but we may less care about the mosquitoes, for instance. But I think multi-species, and especially how Donna Haraway understands species as thinking beyond and also challenging what we think about species. So we can think about viruses, of infectious proteins, prions being part of this public. That is going to force us into some pretty expansive and imaginatory realms. But I think it's really important to think about expanding, but also critiquing that idea of the public. But also, and one thing that we didn't address is the role of technology. And technology plays a very central role in the formation of publics. And this is something that has been part of the science and technology studies research on how a public is conceptualized and formed, that technologies, whether we think of public opinion polls, we can think of language even as a technology that gives rise to this idea of the public. Increasingly, I think that we have digital technologies that are both enabling certain types of publics, but also, as you mentioned, very much disabling and forcing us into public conversations that become very polarized, that we get into an us and a them kind of mentality that is so, so dangerous. I want to just come back to one thinker that has informed both Melanie and I, and that's the work of John Dewey. And John Dewey's work is really important to me, and particularly because he recognized the importance of democratization and really upheld this idea of the public. I think we live in a time now where democracy is under an incredible amount of threat, as we know from everything from presidential debates and the ways that elections are unfolding, the rise of anti-democratic parties. It's dangerous. Plus, as you mentioned, the kinds of social media conversations that we have. This is why it's all the more urgent to think seriously about how we conceptualize democracy and how we conceptualize publics. And going back in time to the work of philosophers like John Dewey, this is from The Public and Its Problems. And this is where I really credit Dewey with opening up the space of thinking about the public. So for Dewey, the public was all those affected by the indirect consequences of a transaction to the extent that it is deemed necessary to have those consequences cared for. I'm paraphrasing Dewey's quote. And by transaction, Dewey really viewed human activity collaboratively and collectively. So not to focus on individuals, but to focus on the collective and to focus on these changes that happen about. So publics for Dewey emerged because of issues that weren't resolved. Now we could take Dewey a bit further. Dewey was a humanist. He didn't really have these more than human sensibilities, but we can push Dewey a bit further through the work of people like Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, and many others who have worked in the more than human spaces. And that is happening to think about those transactions, if you will, as complex entanglements among humans, animals, and I would say technologies as well. Again, it's a complex endeavor, but I think that it really gets us to the heart of where democratic conversations are happening and perhaps some avenues for the future that we could be creating those futures right now just by being attentive to what is happening in our public venues. I just want to add to that with things like biotechnologies, animals are also being turned into technologies that are addressing those problems. And that's something that I think also warrants our attention.
I've got so many questions, and this always happens near the end of the interviews where I'm like, oh my God, I've got like a bazillion questions, because even it sounds like you have slightly of an action network theory type where you've got a whole bunch of different moving parts, technology, environment, animals. And whenever I hear this, I don't know, I find that the hair on my back stands up a little bit, because I think, is it a matter of saying they are and maybe this is speaking to that deficit model that you were talking about, my immediate concern is that, are we saying that the ethics of dealing with technology is the same as the ethics of what animals are going through? Like, I immediately become concerned that somehow by having this diffuse focus, we are not bringing into view the very kind of serious, violent ways in which animals are not only treated, but experience that treatment, right? Like it's an actual experience. But then perhaps this is a failure of myself, that all you're doing here is to say, unless we recognize the complexity with which these systems operate, we can't take seriously that violence and we can't respond to that violence. Have you encountered this kind of critique before? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, I know that we want to be succinct. So all I'll say is yes, and yes and yes. And for me, coming back to your questions towards the beginning of my point of entry as an academic into the world of animals, if you will, is that it was upsetting to me to read examinations of laboratory work by scientists and have everything in the category of the non-human, as though a mouse so-called model and a sensor are of the same order. Like, what happens that within social science research that we and I mean this in an expansive way, but there can be this permission to equate like with unlike. What happens there? So that's all I'll say. And yes, that's it. Those are examples of how I feel like we're hopefully bringing threads together and a global community.
I just wanted to say, I increasingly think it's okay to be unsettled. And when we get our sensibilities at that kind of hair raising on the back of your neck, the sense that, wait a minute, this is unsettling my conceptions of the world. I think that's a really important feeling, affect, if you will, to sit with, because our ideas in English are ideas that have populated not only academic discourse, but our governance institutions. For the most part, and I'll speak from a Canadian sense, but I think that we can think of these in a broader, I guess, colonial context. Those can be rooted to ideas that have emerged from Europe and that have at their heart exclusionary ways of thinking. There is an exceptionalism that is rooted in our ideas of publics, of democracy, of technology. All those English words, again, we need to be able to communicate, but they also trap us within a particular heritage. So it's okay to be unsettled. It opens up uncertainty and an unraveling that I think is of absolute importance. And I will say that in a settler colonial nation that we currently call Canada, attending to and opening up that unsettling is very important. We still have to make decisions, and we will make decisions. But if we can do those decisions in a sense of being open to other possibilities, to recognizing that we will create harms, that there's trade-offs, but just reducing the amount of harms that are happening to groups that have been subject to historical violence is at least a consideration that I want to add in is, can we do less harm to those who have been harmed? It's not perfect, but it's a step better than what we have done.
Yeah, and to not kind of hide behind, like you said earlier, I think to resist the us and them mentality is really important. And I think earlier on you had mentioned, should we just do away with the idea of public? And I'm not too sure that we can ever escape our histories that have brought us to where we are. We can refuse to use the word public for whatever reason, but it will still, there are ideas and ideologies behind it. And I think we have to think about the roots underneath it. You started this interview kind of giving me a bit of I was going to say epidemiology, but that's not. What's the epidemiology is health? What's the background of words? Not the epistemology, not the epidemiology, the
Etymology.
Yes, thank you. You gave kind of the breakdown of both public and health, and I think it shows they change and they adapt with time, but they've got roots that go far beyond just their surface. So we can deny using the word, but it's actually how we enact the idea of public. And I think this is what you guys have brought up throughout today, through representation, through discussion, through recognizing, through it's all about enacting publics in a way that's more sensitive and as you said earlier, Melanie, fair. So this has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for giving me so much of your time. I'm going to give you a quick minute to tell me about your quote and what inspired you to tell the quote, and then we'll start wrapping things up.
So it's been agreed that I'll be the spokesperson for the quote. And the quote is taken from a paper from 2011 by Mars and Lazone. The title is Materials and Devices of the Public, an Introduction. And the journal was Economy and Society. This was a special issue on that topic. And here is the quote. And it's quite long and a bit convoluted. So I'm going to encourage people who may not be following it carefully to look at the original and also the first paragraph of that paper, which gives some really, I think, important questions that we could pursue. Okay. So this in a way is their answer to those questions at the outset of their article, their introductory essay. The idea that language is the central vehicle of politics, that language, in fact, founds and sustains the difference between human politics and the lives and quarrels of those, beasts or gods, who exist outside the polity, is so deeply ingrained in our preconceptions of the political that it is almost impossible to imagine a public, particularly a democratic one, not constituted primarily by acts of discursive deliberation. And we provided this quote at the beginning of a paper published now 10 years ago called Animal Publics in Society and Animals.
And I think this talks to some of what you were talking about earlier, that we can't just focus on language. And I think we didn't dive deeply into it. I don't know if one of you maybe want to speak about how can we go beyond language when thinking about healthy publics? Why is that even an important move when trying to challenge the idea of public health, to move beyond language and discourse? Gwendolyn, any ideas?
I think that we can see again that idea of visibility, so that we start to understand the role that technologies, for instance, are playing, that technologies are not rooted only in language. So they're obviously tied to language, but it's not only tethered to language. And if we tether our understanding of democracy, or specifically publics, to this idea of language, again, we introduce that idea of human exceptionalism. And I think that the tendency then is to fall into this idea of the agora, right? Of individuals talking to one another, or of a community of similar types of individuals, that it's an easy slippage. So if we decenter language, it's not getting rid of language, but rather decentering language in our understanding of publics, we can start to open up understanding how else a public is formed through technologies, but also through these transactions, as Dewey mentioned. I would say intra-actions, as Karen Barad put it, that our publics are sites of complex constructions that include language, but exceed beyond it and extend beyond it. There's a material aspect to publics that also bears attention.
It's so interesting because I feel like several scholars are tackling the same idea of language being put on a pedestal by saying animals have language, and that's why they should be heard. They just don't speak in the same ways we speak. So we need to think more materially about how they use their bodies, how they move through space. Whereas I think what you're saying here is not so much to focus on who is speaking or how they're speaking, but how the actual interactions, how the practicing of politics, of health, creates certain opportunities or discourages certain actions. That there's an interesting, it's a different angle that you're thinking about language from there.
And we might think of other terms, like articulation is a term that's often used in cultural studies. It's a term that Donna Haraway uses as well. Articulations as connections. And so publics, I think for me, are really spaces of important connections. Those connections may not have been made before, but they're in connections that are really important to be attentive to, because they can, in many ways, address the gaps that we have, the institutional gaps, the environmental, the even the physiological gaps that are taking place that are causing problems. So we can attune to an emergent public if we can push beyond these age-old ideas of publics as being tethered to language.
Fascinating. Melanie, do you have something you want to add there?
Well, Claudia, you highlighted the main thing I just wanted to add or emphasize, and that was about materiality, about bodies. So what I would just in one sentence want to highlight is that when we emphasize language as being the cardinal characteristic of humanity, which makes us political, then we deny implicitly so much of our biology as human beings, not to mention the biology that we share with so many other species, including Drosophila, fruit flies, mosquitoes, and so forth. So that element, that the issues that matter politically cannot possibly only be matters of language, or they wouldn't exist.
Oh, man, it's been such a good conversation. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for bending my brain and helping me to think through this really. And this follows on so nicely from the previous season where we looked at politics. And I think the connections between politics and health are age old. So thinking through what the future of health might look like and healthy relations, I think is exciting. So before we close, could you give me a sense of what you guys are working on now? And if listeners are interested in your work or finding out more about your work, where could they find or learn more?
I could go first on that. So as I've mentioned with email conversation with you, Claudia, I'm working on revising a book chapter about multispecies entanglements. And I'm also trying to drive to completion in article form a paper in collaboration with colleagues in veterinary medicine about, if you will, free clinics or low cost to people and pets provision of veterinary services in Calgary. So there's a partnership between a local nonprofit organization and the University of Calgary.
Brilliant. Gwen?
A project that I'm currently working on, which I alluded to previously, was looking at the effects of genetic modification on animals and what that means for democratic engagement and for public engagement. And so one of the things that we've seen in Canada has been the approval of genetically modified animals, that they have moved from a research and development domain into commercialization, so that we see for the first time, really, at least in a Canadian context, the release of genetically modified animals into our public domains. And we have fish, glowfish, we have salmon, and we also have fruit flies that are genetically modified to create proteins, pharmaceutical proteins. And so we are now looking at what the implications are of those approvals and what that means right now for our for public engagement and democratic engagement as well. So it's very exciting. And I think we're also coming into a place where animals, through biotechnology, are being turned into technologies themselves. It's not only genetic engineering, but it's also digital technologies as well, because I think genetic technologies and digital technologies are now converging into what we might call the biodigital. So it's a space to open up to think in a generative way, and in a way perhaps that's different than previous conversations around these technologies.
Yeah, I know. I think Barra did a really interesting paper about like animals as infrastructure, which I thought was quite, because I think animals have been used as technology and infrastructure. And I mean, for a long, here in Vienna, they're currently using sheep to mow the island because they don't want to use lawnmowers anymore because it's a challenge to biodiversity and they don't want to impact insect life. So, but they're not genetically modified. So they're still being used as a technology where their life experience is not necessarily the key thing that's taken into consideration. They're being mobilized as a technology to address climate change issues, which I think is just really a fancy and interesting kind of case study. But of course, when you start to add, I think, bodily changes and the idea that you're just genetically modifying animals and really, like, I think that makes people feel quite icky. I think people have always felt icky about GMOs generally, but now animals that are being But then on the other hand, I find some people really are very unquestioning about it. The fact that you'll just genetically modify mosquitoes so that they can't breed anymore, people are like, yeah, that makes total sense. That's exactly what we need. And sometimes I'm like, have you not watched any horror films? Anyway, I'm clearly losing the plot. I'm sorry. It's after 7 p.m. And at that time, my brain starts to go to goo. Thank you, both of you. I will put your contact details in the show notes so that if people want to learn more about your projects that are really interesting and fascinating, they can find out more. And I look forward to learning more myself. So thank you so much for being on the show. Hi, Priya. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight. It's good to have you back on the show. Who are we focusing on today?
Hi, Claudia. Thank you again for having me. So today I will be narrating an ethnographic vignette from my field notes that follows a young skinny dog Huddy, aka Bones, who arrived one cold October evening in the rural marketplace where I was conducting my fieldwork in India back in 2023. So Huddy's story highlights some of the social and moral entanglements that co-produce everyday life in public spaces. Taking these everyday entanglements into account may help open imaginative and institutional spaces for non humans to be formally counted as part of publics in discussions of public health and healthy publics. The evening Huddy arrived in the market had been a more or less usual day. I was sitting with Rahul outside his shop around where several free living street dogs usually like to rest. Rahul had laid down flattened cardboard boxes for dogs to lie on and placed a water bucket next to the street for them to quench their thirst. I was almost ready to call it a day when suddenly I heard Prakashda exclaim from across the street. He shouted, "Are, look, whose dog is that? He is so skinny. Bilkul Haddi, that is, all bones." I turned to spot a small, dark, disheveled figure emerging from the bend in the street. The dog was young, his ribs protruded visibly, and his left paw was slightly twisted out towards the side. As he approached, one of the onlookers jeered at him. "Oi, Huddy, where have you come from?" As Huddy got closer to Rahul's shop, the dogs lying around immediately got up. They barked and went up to sniff Huddy. This is a commonplace meeting gesture among dogs. Once satisfied that the new arrival posed no immediate threat, the dogs lost interest and left him alone. But when Huddy neared the threshold of Prakashda's sweet shop, I watched as Prakashda raised his hand, widened his eyes, and shouted, "Hut, hut," to scare him away. Huddy retreated, and I grabbed my things and followed him. I saw Huddy navigate the market spaces, entering shops when the shopkeepers were distracted. Water was thrown at him, accompanied by shouts of "hur hur" and "hut hut." Huddy dodged human feet and wheels on the street, these humans trying to avoid Huddy in turn. When the dog finally got tired, he had a rest under the shade of a parked vehicle. The marketplace has its rhythms, rules, and ways of being that Huddy was clearly not accustomed to. The other dogs in the market also learn through experience and sometimes are actively socialized by people to become proper market residents. In general, the streets, alleyways, and outdoor pavements that make up the market are public spaces open to dogs like Huddy. Dogs regularly encounter and negotiate these spaces with other humans and non humans going about their business. There are unspoken social expectations, which include obligations of avoidance, accommodation, and indifference. These practices enable diverse characters to assemble and momentarily intersect in the multi species spaces such as the market. While Huddy took a nap on the street side, I kept watch from a nearby pavement. Later in the day, he got up and walked to a food stalls and started looking up at the customers standing outside. One of the people there, whom I later found out was a local taxi driver called Sonu, looked down at Huddy and offered him the last pieces of the samosa that he was eating. Huddy ate voraciously. He must have been really hungry. When I asked Sonu why he gave Huddy his samosa, he simply replied, and I quote, "Now that poor dog just came in front of me, so I gave him. This is the work of our dharam, that is, duty." That dog was also looking at me with asha, that is, hope. If in the dog's place there was a poor child or a disabled person, I would have done the same. It was only later, during a conversation with Rakesh Da, a local restaurant owner, that I realized how Sonu's sense of duty towards Huddy squared with a general indifference that I observed towards street dogs in the market. Rakesh Da told me that he did not care about the dogs in the market, but I also often saw him giving leftovers from his kitchen to the dogs who regularly approached him outside his restaurant. To explain how he related with those dogs, he used me as an example. He said, "Now see, I used to see you every day walking about the market streets, but I did not go up to you to say anything or intervene. I thought, let him do whatever he is doing. But now today you have come here to ask me questions for your research, so I will do my best to help you with whatever knowledge I have." The dogs, for Rakesh Da, are one among many known and unknown human and non human beings whom he indifferently accommodates in the public spaces of the market. His indifference, however, turns into active assistance and care in personal encounters when others are in need, whether that be a human researcher or a street dog. Like Sonu, Rakesh Da considers it his duty to respond in these personal encounters. While I was still following and observing Huddy in the market, I heard a voice from behind me. Are, a new recruit of the market. It was Sham, a local retailer I knew. He went on. One of his legs is crooked, which is not good, and it also gets really cold in the night, which will be a challenge for such a skinny dog. But now that he is in the market, he might just survive. I looked at Sham cynically and I asked, "But who will take care of this dog here? Whose responsibility is he?" Sham smiled and then, while shrugging, raised both his hands and circled around in the air, gesturing towards the whole of the market. He then pointed towards the group of street dogs nonchalantly sleeping nearby and said, "Look, they are also being raised by the market." In doing so, Sham signaled beyond personal duties towards others, emerging from individual encounters towards a collective reckoning with our shared obligations to care for others whom we share our public spaces with. Even though it is increasingly acknowledged that health entails caring for each other, mainstream interpretations of public health still consider those caring and being cared for as exclusively being humans. That is, the public in public health is considered as human collectives. However, taking a closer look at our everyday public spaces helps us reconsider the boundaries of our collectives. As the reactions and responses to Huddy in the marketplace highlight, publics can also include non humans. Such publics often arise out of everyday embodied encounters in shared spaces where humans and non humans try to find ways to eke out living within societal norms and expectations, and where we also find ourselves obligated to share, care, and make way for those in our presence, whether they be human or non humans.
Wonderful. I really enjoy your insights and your observations. And I mean, I almost feel like I can feel the market there and see Huddy bones, small little dog with protruding bones, trying like appealing and pleading with people in the market and also other dogs in the market for trying to navigate and find his way. But what I find really interesting in your observation there is it's not just about caring for and attending to these animals. There's also a certain amount of, I guess, ambivalence or ignoring that needs to happen. So you can't just be constantly concerned. It's not as though the humans are constantly concerned with these dogs. They are also somewhat ignored in the market.
Definitely. I think that's a very key point that you highlighted there. How I take it as another form of sharing, and neglecting others' presence in your space also could be a form of passive act of sharing. At its root, like if you are not intervening, like how Ramesh da explained how he accommodated me in the marketplace. I was just there doing my own thing, and he did not care. He thought I can do whatever I can. That was the same thing that people thought about the dogs. So the indifference was not necessarily a negative thing. The people were not necessarily driving the dogs away, but just letting them be. Basic form of sharing that often is not taken into account, I would say.
I think it's really, really interesting because if you think about the public, I mean, if every time I stepped out, sometimes people who I don't want to attend to me or give me attention, giving me attention makes the public a really awkward and weird place. We almost need this kind of accepted awareness of one another while at the same time an ability to kind of ignore each other a little bit so that we can move through public space with some semblance of freedom. And I think that's really an important insight because so often in animal studies we speak about caring and attending to. And of course, yeah, I'm not saying the opposite of that is not to abuse them, but there is something important happening in the word you used there was indifference, and I think it's really an important part of the public, which is really quite remarkable.
No, no, definitely. So there were two acts of sharing, I would say. The first is the general form of indifference that I
Mm.
saw towards the dogs, of just letting them live their lives where people lived their own. And the other was form of active sharing, as in the case of Sonu giving his samosa to Haddi. And
Hmm.
in these forms of active caring, people would make often these judgments of whom they should give. For example, like if our listeners also listen to the previous animal highlights, like I talked about Bella and her being pregnant and people being taking care of Bella while she was pregnant. So when a dog is like Bella is pregnant, she is considered as a moral being, as a moral agent who is deserving of people's act of giving and assistance.
Hmm.
So in general, people would not go out of the way of like giving food to every dog, but they
Yeah.
would consider which dog is more vulnerable and needs our assistance, because people would generally consider these dogs as being able to take care of themselves, that they do not always need people's attention. People would make decisions about who is vulnerable. In this case, Haddi was visibly weaker than the other dogs. So Sonu and other people also like came in later on to help Haddi. And it was the same case with Bella and her being pregnant. So she
Yeah.
was considered more in need of assistance.
No, it's all super, super interesting because I mean, I think there's also perhaps an awareness and alertness to vulnerability, but also maybe once you've created a relationship, which I think we spoke a bit about last time, once you've created a relationship with a specific dog, once Hadi has made himself known to specific people, he'll probably seek out those people again, and a more sustained relationship can form between them, right? Where people are giving not only to dogs I assume that they view as being more vulnerable, but dogs who they are solidifying a relationship with, right?
No, definitely. So that often happened, that people at first would not want to give to the dogs, because people would not want to have active relationships with the dogs or any kind of animals, because it was often told to me that if you give to an animal once, it you are brought into a relationship with that animal,
Hmm.
because it was the same with the dogs. Some cows and ox that I saw also used to visit specific marketplaces, and so specific shops in marketplaces and specific houses where they had a history of receiving food. And yeah, so people would at first not want to give, but then over time there would be relationships that would be created. And for example, Ramesh Da, whom I mentioned in my narrative, he told me that he considered himself a chacha, a uncle of some of the dogs in the marketplace, and he used to tell me now that they won't go to everyone else, they know who cares for them.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's something that I also saw in my observations, that when dogs used to go to only used to go to specific people's shops and houses where they had formed relationships, but they would avoid other places where they had some negative interactions, and they would associate that they're not really welcome.
Yeah, so you can
Yeah.
really see the dogs are making decisions, informed decisions about where to go and what to do. Just out of interest, do you know what happened to Huddy? So you did these observations. He was getting food. He was obviously very malnourished. Any idea what happened to him?
Yep. So after a few days of these events, I got to know that Huddy actually got adopted by a local tailor, who at first kept him with him in the room that he lived outside of the market. And then after a few days, he took Huddy to his village. It was only after like 3 months that I saw Huddy again, when he again came roaming in the marketplace. But this time, like, he looked much healthier. He seemed to have taken up a life as a pet and a guard dog with the tailor.
Wow. Okay, so the tailor had taken him to his village and had maybe brought him back to visit, and you were still there. It's so cool that you were able to see the kind of circle of this story. And he made, like we were just saying, he made a connection and a relationship in the market that went beyond the market.
Yes, definitely. So the tailor also found him in the market, and so the tailor also like told me how he met Huddy. So he just said that yeah, he saw Huddy outside of his shop, and he just gave Huddy some food, and then yeah, Huddy just like kept coming every day to his place, and then how he put it was that I saw him and he saw me, and he liked me and I liked him. So we just like yeah, I just decided that I'm going to adopt him.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, I hope that they are still happy together, the two of them. And I'm happy to hear that he still has some freedom to roam the market and he's not as bony as he once was. Well, thank you so much, Priya. This was a delight. I look forward to hearing your next observations and insights into dogs and multi-species health. Have a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thank you so much to Melanie Rock and Gwendolyn Blue for being amazing guests and giving so generously of their time on the show today. To Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, to Priyashnu Thapliel for an incredible animal highlight, and Rebecca Shen for her design work. Thank you also to our sponsors, to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, Apple for sponsoring the podcast, as well as to the Row Indies Project for sponsoring this season, and the Phoenix Zones Initiative for also sponsoring this episode. This episode was produced by myself and edited together with Christian Lentz. This is The Animal Turn, with me, Claudia Huttenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.